Husband vanishes after wife's shocking infidelity secret. Gene spotted her as soon as she walked in. He had no doubt that it was Melissa. Truthfully, it took him a moment to realize the difference between her. The dress, with the overly short dress with the overly open bodice allowing the top of the lacy bra to be seen, was the same. The long red hair that had every possible color added to it was the same. Then he realized that the gold wire-rimmed glasses were missing, and the blush on her cheeks that had come from years of fighting the blemishes common to redheads with pale skin was gone. Apparently, advances in the treatment of skin problems had been effective, and her face looked perfectly clear. It was a noticeable enough difference, and for a moment he thought that perhaps it was just a woman who looked like Melissa. But upon closer inspection, Gene became convinced of that. His ex-wife? She couldn't be called his ex-wife, they had never divorced. Instead, he had simply died in the eyes of the law, and that was the end of it. Gene returned to his drink on the bar, a vodka tonic. He was different now. Back then he drank whiskey and Coke. A neatly trimmed mustache, a completely bald head, and dark-rimmed glasses he didn't need. That was enough, he knew. Yes, he'd been embarrassed even in the mirror at first, and even more so when combined with his weight loss. The weight loss had been considerable, over 40 pounds. He had been guilty of it himself, settling for chips, ice cream, things that really should be consumed in moderation. Exercise was work, and by the time he got home, working the lever on the side of his overly stuffed chair, that was the bottom line. It was a bit risky to return to this town, but Gene decided to take the risk, at his beck and call. After all, he was supposed to be dead. That's what the judge had said anyway. The newspaper clipping was delivered to a private mailbox. No note, nothing, just the clipping. Enough time had passed for the court to declare him dead. The woman was undoubtedly Melissa, his ex-wife. He watched her in the mirror as she looked in his direction. But, absorbed in a laughing conversation with the woman she was with, she gave no sign of recognition. She would still be his wife were it not for the fact that William Carl Miller was dead. That thought flashed through Gene's mind that afternoon as he was deciding how to proceed. Sure, he could just divorce Melissa, but with the state's community property law and the courts always going back and forth, he knew full well he'd end up on the losing end. Once the lawyers started digging, they'd find something he hadn't bothered to mention to his wife. There was a reason for that, of course. Melissa had a funny habit of enjoying spending money. She got annoyed when he set a budget for her and all, but she managed to keep things under control because once she went over the limit, her cards didn't work anymore. There was no problem with the house. The down payment was small and the interest rate was high, and Melissa would be lucky to get out of this situation with any money at all. Gene had withdrawn all the savings he had accumulated in nearly a year of preparation and invested them in cash with the only person who knew the truth. In an attempt to control some of his wife's wasteful habits, he never paid off the damned house, but used it as another excuse to keep her in line. If she ever found out the truth about what he'd accumulated, she'd go crazy trying to spend it all, which he did, spending several $1,000s at a time. Melissa never paid attention to his funds. She was too caught up in her circle of friends and waiting for the paychecks he brought home from work to clear his cards and start over. There was no written record of what he did. Sure, it was a risk, but Dave Hansen was someone he'd known since elementary school. Bill had carried Dave out of the jungle in Vietnam, and his friend's blood ran down his back, mixing with his own as the world around them brightened. That day had been one hell of a day, with mud sloshing around them and Bill running right in full view of everyone to get his friend out. It didn't stop after they reached the bush and then the river. He held Dave's head above the water as they swam for several miles. There were all sorts of critters pouncing on them in the river, but luckily, nothing bigger than leeches, and small predatory fish were caught. Yeah, he could trust Dave Hansen. Brothers are what men become at times like this. There is no stronger bond. It's more than blood, and no one can understand that until they've lived through it. 3 times he'd brought the nearly new 1979 Chevrolet Impala to the dealership, complaining that it was tugging in the parking lot. Of course, it wasn't tugging, but now the record was up. That Wednesday morning, he pulled off the road next to a bluff 50 miles south. There was no guardrail, and it was almost 100 feet to the ocean, with huge rocks lying below. The tide was low, and coming in, he made sure of that. Leaving the car in the parking lot, he rolled down the driver's side window and got out of the car. Reaching out, he shifted the lever into reverse. Almost instantly, the car began to slowly roll backwards, just as he'd anticipated, right over the edge. The tiny scooter he kept in the trunk started immediately, and he moved it to the sidewalk so as not to leave a trail. The scooter had been sold for cash off Craigslist. The purchase had been made by Dave Hansen, and there was no way to trace it back to Bill. Panic gripped him for a moment when another car drove by, but they didn't even seem to notice him. A dozen miles off the highway, Bill left the tiny scooter deep in the bush, climbed into the old Buick he'd also bought with cash, and drove off. William Carl Miller was dead, and Jean was alive now. A man can get lost in Mexico, especially if no one on Earth expects him to be there. The documents Jean carried with him were excellent. It was just amazing how easy it was to do. Find a child who was born and then lost. All the information you need is there. Apply for and get a perfectly valid Social Security number. Even a copy of the birth certificate. How Dave had managed that, Jean didn't know, but he had it. It took a lot of effort to become someone else, but for Jean, it was worth it. William Carl Miller was dead and gone, apparently consumed by sea creatures. He was now Jean Fitzgerald. It might seem strange, but that was how Jean felt now, after all. It had been over 10 years since that horrible day when he had followed Melissa, and barely 8 years since he had died. His heart jumped to his throat as his suspicions were confirmed. She climbed the outside steps to the second-floor apartment and knocked on the door. The man who opened the door was tall and young, younger than William by at least a dozen years. He put his arms around Melissa and kissed her very familiar lips. And William knew immediately that she had been up those steps before. William could have complicated things right here and now, but he wasn't that kind of man. Snapping out of his seat, getting into a violent confrontation was not his style. They never heard William come up the steps and stop at the door to listen. He heard it. Those familiar sounds that he had only recently realized no longer belonged to him alone. It was enough, and he realized it, turned, and walked away. From that point on, he began to make his plans. It took quite a long time, but William never rushed into anything frivolous. His investment plan worked the same way. Just let the money grow, one step at a time, smoothly and steadily. The plan was to build up a nice margin for when he and his wife Melissa reached their golden years. Then things took a turn for the worse when he moved to Amazon. The $2,000 he paid for the stock went up over 3,000%. Sure, you could talk about skill, but it was just luck. The broker he was talking to suggested it, and he just took it. Of course, it wasn't bad capital. Melissa never paid attention to such things. She was too busy with her clubs, shopping with her girlfriends, and afternoon spa visits. He also kept a mailbox for such things, but by now he knew well enough not to mention having extra money. Being extremely social, she was much more outgoing than her husband, and as a result was constantly involved in something. And that was a definite plus, given his plans. So, just a couple months before that day, he'd bought a new Impala, putting a payment contract on it. He then made several trips to the dealership, mentioning that the car might pop out of the parking lot. Of course, that didn't happen, but the record was made. Detective Royster examined the scene. The break-in had been brutal, one of those things that happen in a home invasion. It seemed clear. But Detective Royster had been on the police force long enough to know when something smelled, and in this case it smelled just like that. The man's body, lying on the bathroom floor, showed signs of a rather prolonged beating. There were signs of drug sales everywhere, though all that was left were leftovers on the table and scales, piled bags, a few boxes of sandwich bags. Meth, nasty stuff, but certainly profitable. He pulled out a notebook, made some notes. All he had to do was wait for the results of the forensics. It took him less than a week to figure out that the man's primary victim was a woman named Melissa, who was his landlord. Now that was interesting. Royster happened to remember her. A few months earlier, her husband had somehow managed to fall off a cliff into the ocean, and the body had never been found. He'd smelled it too, but he'd never found anything to indicate that it wasn't just an incident. The only thing that didn't settle in his mind was why. Why was her husband even parked on the side of the road 50 miles from home? The interview with her wasn't so abnormal, of course. She was a bit evasive at first, and then finally admitted to the long affair. Royster set that information aside, making a note to remind himself to make inquiries in case her husband disappeared. Nasty-looking thing, thought Royster to himself. Too many breasts, too short a skirt, too much makeup for showing up at a murder investigation, and no tears. Of course, that didn't mean anything. Some people cry, some people fall apart, some people manage to hold it together until they seclude themselves. Then came the DNA. The victims, of course. Melissa's, of course. Fingerprints, a few that were easy to find and a few that failed. And DNA from William Carl Miller, the ex-husband. Of course, he lived in the same house not too long ago. Still, it all stunk. The victim was very close to living in that house full-time and had been living there for some time, having moved in just a few months after the Miller boyfriend drove off a cliff. The woman, Melissa, lives in an apartment alone, miles away. What kind of situation did she have? Could be drug-related, but there's no way to prove it. At first glance, it looked like a normal landlord-tenant relationship, except the landlord doesn't usually have sex with the tenant and collect rent at the same time. Sure, the female usually lives rent-free and the guy comes in to collect the trade-in money. Sure, Detective Royster has some work to do. Clearly, the broad had sex with the guy periodically, but that didn't mean anything. She admitted it herself, telling him he was cute, paid his rent on time, and she liked sex sometimes. She'd looked him straight in the eye when she'd said it, and he'd almost believed her. But that made the DNA useless to the court. There was another man's DNA, too, but a database search turned up nothing. Oh well. Detective Royster had so much time on his hands that he just put things aside and did what cops do when they can't connect anything. He waited. He seemed to be making payments on the house, much to the widow's comfort. But DNA from a long-gone ex-husband at a crime scene. The house was neat as a pin, meaning either the woman or possibly the victim cleaned regularly. Yeah, the whole thing smelled. Detective Royster put down his notepad and headed back to his office. He wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He had all the time in the world. He was one of those people. Jean looked at Melissa again. This time he caught her gaze. She smiled at him, showing no signs of recognition. Then she headed in his direction. "Hi," she said, walking over to the bar stool next to him. "Hi," Jean replied, looking at her. Still no sign at all. "Are you here alone?" she asked, flirting. Nothing new, she was always like this. "Yeah?" Jean hummed. He was beginning to realize he'd made a mistake. Melissa was too close. "Me too. Mind if I sit down?" she asked, hopping onto the stool next to him before he could answer. She then set her drink on the bar, leaning her shoulder forward like he'd seen literally hundreds of times. It exposed most of her right breast, and she knew it, of course. They had even discussed it in the past. She had called it her decoy. The only thing Melissa radiated was sexuality. She knew it, and she took advantage of it. It was one of the main reasons he had responded to her proposal. That affair had been wild. The woman loved sex and didn't pretend otherwise in the slightest. She hadn't been a virgin in their first union, but neither had William. Their marriage had been tumultuous, too. They'd gone to Reno and then stood in front of some guy in an Elvis costume, for heaven's sake. Then they settled into married life, and for a long time, William thought everything was fine. But stuff happens. The discovery of her affair had come as a shock to him, but deep down he knew it could happen. After all, she was that kind of woman, and she did love sex. It was clear that Melissa didn't recognize him. He was a little afraid that she might understand, but outwardly it didn't show in any way. The only reason Gene was here in this place at all was simple curiosity. Everything he knew from his former life was here, and stopping by on his way to see his friend Dave was just a whim. Meeting his ex-wife had been a coincidence. Now he was sitting here sipping his drink with a woman on the bar stool next to him, and she was flirting mercilessly. An ordinary encounter on an ordinary Saturday night, just like what happens in almost every bar or nightclub anywhere in the world. Drinking, talking, and then going off somewhere to have sex? Melissa became more blatant. She turned in his direction, letting as much of her right breast show as she could without taking any out. Bait! That's what she called herself back in the day. Good bait. Gene felt himself getting aroused. This woman had always done it with ease, and that was why he had married her. And then Gene made a decision. He's going to have sex with his ex-wife. Wow, that's quite a tattoo, exclaimed Melissa, running her hands over the design on Gene's chest. They were quite easily in a neighboring motel room when he suggested they go somewhere more private. He'd gotten that tattoo in Mexico, right after he'd lasered away some rather unkempt chest hair. Years of lifting weights, starting with 10 reps with less than 8 pounds, went up to 100, and finally he started bench pressing 30 pounds with each arm 50 times. The body he had now bore little resemblance to the vanished man. New teeth had changed his face slightly, but enough. Contact lenses had changed his former brown eyes to dark blue, and all of this combined with other changes gave Gene confidence. He was going to sleep with his ex-wife, and she had no idea who he really was. Melissa threw back her top and pulled it off her shoulders. A satisfied smile appeared on her face as she looked at this handsome man she'd picked up. He obviously spent a lot of time working out. His arms were huge and his chest was muscular. The tattoo came as a surprise as she buttoned the buttons on his expensive shirt and saw it. She felt a shiver run through her body as she ran her fingers over the smooth, hairless skin of his chest. She pulled her bra down, letting her freckle-covered breasts heave freely, and his hands reached out to touch them. Melissa noticed the man's gaze fell on her red hair. Next thing she knew, they were having sex. It was strange why she remembered her ex-husband Bill at a time like this, but she did. Gene was lying on the bed, both of them unclothed. He propped himself up on his elbow as Melissa came to her senses. She started to rise, but he reached out and lightly pinned her back to the bed. "I guess you guessed that, huh?" he told her. "Bill?" she asked. "You're just as much fun to have sex with as you used to be, baby," he told her with a smirk. "Jesus, Bill! You look—" "Yeah, I know. I thought you'd never understand, but I guess you do. I'll never tell anyone, really. I know you won't." Gene sat up, stretching. Melissa watched him. How could a man look so completely different and still be the same? "Are you going to—" she asked, trembling. "Kill you? No, but I think I'm going to have sex with you again." He laughed, climbed onto the bed again, and took over. This time he didn't choke her. She had expected it and thought that would be the end of it. For the last time she felt great. Her body was tearing towards him. When she woke up that time, he was gone. Detective Royster sat there thinking about what had just happened. It was just the kind of case he'd been looking for. An old case that had been sitting in his files for years was suddenly back at the top of the list. Why this woman had called and then come in for an interview was incomprehensible. If she'd just kept her mouth shut, the old case of her husband's disappearance and the guy beaten to death would just get covered in dust and disappear without even a memory. When Melissa walked in and sat down at the table, she was completely different than the last time he'd seen her. Before, she had acted confident, commanding. This time, he saw that the woman in front of him was a woman scared to death. It took some time, but he managed to get it all out of her. They were having an affair. Apparently, hubby found out about it and planned his disappearance. Then the woman moved the guy into her house because she couldn't pay and rented a small apartment. The hubby apparently snuck back in, massacred the guy, and disappeared again. After all, how can a dead person commit murder? And then years later, hubby shows up, and coincidentally, she ends up in bed with this guy. Does he strangle her when he makes love in the morning, and she drifts off again into unknown distances? Does she jump the shadows, afraid he'll come back? Does she end up going to the police, hoping for protection, even though in reality the guy is gone and wants to leave? Okay, can't make this garbage up, grinned Detective Royster to himself. Time to see if he could find one Gene Fitzgerald. Was the fellow so relaxed that he wouldn't go off again? Maybe. Gene was sitting in his house looking out the window when he saw a police van pulling up the driveway. The hacienda he'd bought years ago for cash wasn't bad, fairly remote and overlooking the ocean. A young woman named Maria, daughter of a man who kept a small store a few miles away, delivered groceries and supplies to him. Gene always handed her a wad of pesos, and it didn't take him long to convince her to stay for an hour or two. Then she even stayed overnight a few times, and her old man would frown, but Gene would also hand him a pack of pesos, and he would smile again. She had great breasts. It was great. You didn't have to go to a bar to find company, and she loved having sex. At first, he used protection, but she tasted so good he figured she was probably clean. Handing her an extra wad of pesos and hinting that her body was now his and his alone, he smiled and said, "Si, senor." Gene jumped to his feet, made his way to one of the back bedrooms, and opened the secret compartment. He knew exactly what awaited him. Melissa was going to spill her guts. He thought he'd scared her enough to keep her mouth shut, but apparently that hadn't worked. When the local policeman arrived, a conversation ensued between them. An exchange of views. The policeman looked into the briefcase and smiled. "Gracias, but perhaps you'd better find a new place to live, senor," he said to Gene. Detective Royster surveyed the scene. Whoever had broken into the house had really made a mess of things. The woman was lying on the bed, her body completely unclothed. There was no doubt that she was indeed a redhead. Too bad such an attractive woman. He cast one last glance at her before the other men wrapped her up and carried her away. He guessed what had happened. The dispatch from Mexico said that when they went to the home of one Gene Fitzgerald, they found evidence indicating that he had committed suicide by jumping off a cliff into the ocean, and the body had never been found. Detective Royster didn't believe it one bit. He put down his notebook and headed back to his office. He had all the time he needed. Almost a year later, Gene was sitting in a run-down corner bar, sipping the rest of his whiskey from his glass. He beckoned the barmaid to bring another. Things hadn't been going well lately. A quick note from his friend Dave Hansen, informing him that his assets were dwindling, had left him discouraged. The old Toyota he'd bought for the trip back had broken down twice on the way, and it was pissing him off, so he'd hesitated to take the plane. Now Dave was running late, which was not like him at all. There was no way Gene wanted to spend any more time here than he had to. He'd seen the newspaper clippings with his face on them. "Suspicion of murder," the headline read. Of course, that wasn't what he looked like now, but still, not good. Not good at all. One of the barmaids kept trying to make conversation, but he wanted no part of it. By his calculations, Dave had about $750,000, and there was no way he was going to run out of money. Dave said he could explain what had happened, but it would require a face-to-face private meeting. Gene glanced at his watch as a small, stubby man sat down next to him. Gene just ignored him, sure the asshole would want to talk, probably about soccer or some dumb conversation like that. "Hello, Mr. Miller." the man said quietly. Gene turned around for a moment to look at him. Then in a panic, he started to get up, and all that flashed through his mind was to run. The short man's hand darted out and struck Gene's throat, catching him off guard. Gene tried to react, but was too late. He felt himself being thrown off balance and fell as the little man's other leg blocked his barstool leg. Gene tried to catch his breath, but it wouldn't happen. From somewhere suddenly, a multitude of men piled on top of him. Detective Royster slid off the stool and smiled to himself. This guy, Hanson, had given up pretty quickly when it was explained to him that his involvement meant a few years in a jail cell. It was quite clear that he didn't want to do it at first, but facts are facts, and Royster took him at his word. He advised him to send one little note, do it, and maybe the cases he was involved in would just be forgotten. Another case closed. He looked at the untouched shot of whiskey on the bar counter, reached over and tipped the shot back. Not bad, he thought to himself. He made a couple of notes in his notebook, folded it up and slipped it into his pocket. It would be safe to go back to the office and see what else was going on. There was no need to hurry. After all, he had so much time to spare. The end! Subscribe to my channel! Thank you!